When I was a boy, I quite enjoyed school, maths, Latin, English, but there was one subject that made me anxious: religion. I was told that someone in the Old Testament drove his chariot furiously and that another danced delicately. And I wanted to say, and your point is? And there was this chap called Jesus who suggested we should all be kind to each other and not obsessed by power and money, and he got crucified for that. Seemed a bit unfair. I became frightened that something that was so clearly important from the way that people behaved about it was completely incomprehensible. So I decided it was all rubbish, so I became an atheist for about 25 years, and then I read a book by Aldous Huxley that said there were two approaches to religion. One was to do with people hoping to have some experience of the divine, and the other was the religion of words and symbols, which seemed to me to boil down to crowd control. But that first bit got me interested. Now, my first guest here is Helen. Helen, I want you to look at that camera and tell me your name.
The name's Bond. Helen Bond.
Thank you. I love it. Now, you are Professor of Christian Origins at the University of Edinburgh.
Yes, that's right.
And I've asked Helen on because actually we know each other.
We have. We've met before.
We've met before, and you will not believe this. When the Monty Pythons were doing the show at the O2 in 2014, we did 15 performances to 16,000 people. At the very same time, there was a conference going on, right, at University of London?
It was King's College London, and it was put together by our good friend Joan Taylor.
Who can't be with us because she's in New Zealand. And Joan organised, I've been quite serious, a conference about the effects that the film Life of Brian had on biblical studies, right?
And it was one of the most popular conferences ever. People were just queuing up both to be on the lineup and also to come along to the conference.
There's a real book of the proceedings of this conference. So what I can't remember, what did they say that the film had done to help Christian scholarship?
Well, I suppose the thing is it's a useful thing to think with. So we thought about what are the things that the Pythons got right? And there's lots of things that the Pythons got right, particularly to do with the political and social world of the first century, situating Jesus within this Jewish landscape. And also some of the things perhaps that the Pythons got wrong, or that just help us to think a little bit about how we're putting together the life of Jesus.
It was really interesting to think that we actually given proper academics a new perspective. So I thought it would be fun if I asked Helen some questions about Christianity, which are kind of very, very simple, but I think that they're things that people don't know. I mean, for a start, what evidence is there for Christ's existence other than what's in the Bible?
There's actually really good evidence that he existed. It's not from absolutely the same time, but from about sort of 60 years later. There's a Jewish historian called Josephus, and he writes about Jesus. The passage has been edited by Christians, so we have to be a little bit careful about it, but we're pretty sure that he did write something about Jesus.
And he was a Jewish historian?
Jewish historian. He's got no particular axe to grind about Christianity. He just lists it in amongst a sort of a series of tumults and problems that happened when Pontius Pilate was governor. And then within a century of the life of Jesus, we have Roman writers mentioning him. So we have Tacitus, we have Pliny mentioning Christians.
What sort of thing are they saying?
Well, Tacitus, he says that Jesus was executed. He suffered the supreme punishment, crucifixion, under Pontius Pilate. And he's actually interested in Christians in Rome under Nero. So that's what he's telling us about. But just as a sort of sideline, an intro, he just mentions Jesus.
So there's all this evidence that's not from inside the Bible.
Yeah, and the thing is, people will say, oh, well, that's decades later. But given the fact that Jesus was an artisan, he's the kind of person who would not normally show up in any kind of records. And you know, again, we've lost lots and lots of information, lots of written texts from the ancient world, and we know more about Jesus than we actually do about many other significant people from the classical world.
More than we know about.
John, what is this all about?
It's about Christianity.
Hey, they.
All right, let's talk now about the Bible, which is obviously our main source. What were the first time anybody wrote about Jesus was Mark?
No, actually, what people don't always realise is that the earliest Christian texts are from Paul. So probably in the late 40s or so, Paul the Apostle, the one who goes sailing about the Mediterranean and founding Christian churches, he's the first one to write, and he writes letters to all these places that he's visited.
I see what
so they're
you
from
mean.
the 40s, 50s,
Because
that
Christ
kind
is
of date.
crucified at around 33, or is it later?
Around
We don't
about,
know. Round
early
about.
30s, yeah.
So
we don't
within
know.
very few years, Paul is writing about it.
Yeah, so Paul becomes a Christian within, very soon after that, and then he starts on his journeys, and certainly within 15 years or so, he starts to write letters. And Paul knows people who knew Jesus, the disciples.
He's writing letters
so-
to Christian communities
Yeah.
which have already formed.
Yes, some of them he formed himself,
Yeah.
and so he's kind of keeping in touch
Oh,
with
I
them
see.
by letter afterwards.
Now, tell us what the Bible tells us about Jesus. His ministry starts 3 years before his death.
It's very hard to know. I mean,
course,
3 years is taken from John's Gospel, which suggests that there's at least there's 3 Passovers there, so that you've got at least sort of 2.5 years. Mark's Gospel and Matthew and Luke give us no sense of chronology. I mean, maybe 3 years. I mean, maybe longer. We really
So
don't know.
we start in Galilee, and we start with "I shall make you fishers of men."
Yes,
right?
or people, we would say nowadays.
Oh, sorry. Yes, sorry. I forget about this stuff. I'm very old. I know the King James version. Yes, fishers of people. And then we hear about some of his sermons and some of his miracles, healing people, which I find quite possible because there are healers who can do extraordinary things. I think there's no doubt about that at all.
Well, I think it's interesting that in the ancient world, the opponents don't say, no, he couldn't do those things. I mean, some of the rabbinic sources call him a sorcerer, but
really?
what they're disputing is where the power comes from. Is he channeling the power of God, or is he working with evil spirits? But I think historically, Jesus's miracles were probably the most significant thing about him. It's the miracles that draw the crowds. And, in the ancient world, there's very few doctors or people with any medical knowledge.
Absolutely.
Everyone must have had something that they wanted healing. So all these people are coming to him. And in a way, once he's got that captive audience, then he starts to tell them about the kingdom of God, this sort of place, this new realm where God is going to be in charge. And that's when he's got his audience.
After the crucifixion, can you sum up what the Bible says about what happens then in terms of the resurrection?
Well, yeah, so on the Sunday morning, the third day, women come back to the tomb and they find it empty. Don't know quite what to do about it. In Mark's Gospel, they just run off. That's it. They're terrified. And in the other Gospels, they also include appearances of the risen Jesus.
Yeah.
And so that then, I suppose, persuades Jesus' followers that he's not dead, but he has... And in their language of the Gospels, he has been risen. He has been raised. So he's been raised by God. This isn't something he does, but God raises him up.
There's always this gap between the fact that religions are always founded by mystics, and I think Christ was a mystic, Most of us don't go into the desert for 40 years. I think
40 days, not
40 days!
I don't think we'd survive 40
That would have
years.
upset biblical studies. 40 days. He was a mystic, and yet religions seem to finish up being administered by people who are definitely not mystics and who seem to be a bit more like bureaucrats who are determined to preserve the power of the organization.
They're started by mystics or charismatics, people who, by the strength of their own personality, their sense of the spirit, can gather crowds around them. My reading of certainly certain periods of Christianity is that this sort of move towards bureaucracy often happened with the best of intentions. So, in those early years, Christians thought that the end of the world was coming. When they realised that it wasn't coming quite so soon as they'd thought, they start to realise that, we've got to plan. We've got to plan to be in the world. We've got to sort of batten down the hatches. We've got to look respectable. And that's the point, actually, where women start to be sort of pushed down and smothered by Christianity.
Oh, that's extraordinary.
In Jesus' time, women are disciples. There's very good evidence for women disciples. And even Paul, who gets a bad press on this, he talks about women as deacons. He sends letters with women. He talks about women as apostles. He's very open to women's ministry.
Does this all change with Constantine?
But I think a lot of the damage had been done by then. The sort of hierarchy had already developed. It became much more sort of articulated and clear-cut by that time. Women had already been sort of pushed down and oppressed. And I think throughout the history of the church, there's always some threat, whether that's the rise of science or rationalism, and often I think the way that the church reacts, probably wrongly, is to sort of batten down the hatches. We believe that fundamentalism.
It works as a sort of a power organisation. Helen, it's just been an absolute delight. You've told me stuff I've been thinking about. I won't say all my life. I say since I started reading stuff preparatory to writing Life of Brian. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.